I spent 47 years building things with my hands, houses, bridges, a life. But nothing prepared me for the moment I drove 6 hours in my '99 Ford F-150 to watch my only daughter get married, only to find my face printed on a laminated card at the security gate with a thick red X through it. My name is Arthur Vance. I'm 75 years old. My hands look like tree bark, and my face tells the story of every construction site I've ever managed. To the world, I'm just an old man in a noisy truck. To my daughter Jessica, 26 years old, I had become something worse than invisible. I had become an embarrassment. The security guard didn't even look apologetic. He just held up that photo like it was a warrant. Below my crossed-out face, 4 words ended my fatherhood. Do not permit entry. Jessica was marrying Ryan, a 29-year-old who called himself a cryptocurrency visionary. He had convinced my daughter that I would ruin the aesthetic of their $200,000 wedding at a luxury resort in Napa Valley. My work boots and calloused hands didn't match the champagne towers and string quartets. What they didn't know was that the money paying for those champagne towers didn't come from Ryan's supposedly wealthy family. It came from me, through an anonymous fund, and the resort they chose for their perfect day? I'm the majority shareholder of the company that owns it. I didn't argue with the security guard. I didn't make a scene. I just turned my truck around, pulled onto the shoulder of the highway, and made one phone call to my lawyer in San Francisco. Activate Clause 14C, I said. 5 minutes later, every light in that ballroom went dark. Let me back up 6 months to when this whole mess started. Jessica had always been my pride. After her mother died when she was 12, I raised her alone. I worked double shifts on construction sites to send her to good schools. I showed up to every parent-teacher conference with grease still under my fingernails. I taught her to change a tire, balance a checkbook, and never take handouts from anyone. Somewhere along the way, she forgot those lessons. She met Ryan at a tech conference in San Francisco. He drove a Tesla, wore expensive watches, and talked about disrupting industries. Within 3 months, she had moved into his apartment in the Marina District. Within 6 months, they were engaged. When she brought him to meet me at my cabin in Sacramento, I knew something was off. Ryan looked at my workshop like it was a museum exhibit. He asked if I still did manual labor with this tone that made it sound like a disease. He kept checking his phone during dinner, and when Jessica mentioned I had built the cabin myself, he said something about how charming it was that some people still valued traditional craftsmanship. I bit my tongue. This was my daughter's choice, and I wanted to support her. Then came the wedding planning. Jessica stopped returning my calls. When she finally answered, she explained that Ryan's family was very involved in the arrangements. His parents were sophisticated people from old money in Connecticut. They had very specific ideas about how things should be done. I offered to contribute. I had savings. I owned property. I wasn't rich, but I could help. Jessica told me not to worry about it. Ryan's family was covering everything. She said it so quickly, so dismissively, that I knew she was lying. I hired a private investigator, not because I wanted to spy on my daughter, but because something in my gut told me she was being manipulated. Within 2 weeks, I had a file on my desk that made my blood run cold. Ryan's parents weren't from Connecticut. They were actors from Los Angeles, hired for $200 an hour to play the part of wealthy socialites. Ryan's cryptocurrency fortune? He had lost everything in a bad investment 18 months ago. He was now $400,000 in debt to a gambling operation in Las Vegas. His Tesla was leased and 3 months behind on payments. The wedding wasn't being paid for by anyone. It was all debt, credit cards pushed to their limits, vendor deposits with no intention of final payment. Ryan was running a con, and my daughter was the mark. I could have told Jessica right then. I could have shown her the file and watched her world collapse, but I knew her well enough to know she wouldn't believe me. She would think I was jealous, that I couldn't handle her marrying someone successful. Ryan had already started planting those seeds, making casual comments about how some parents have trouble letting go. So I did something different. I quietly paid off every vendor, the caterer, the florist, the photographer, the band. I used an anonymous corporate account, funneling the money through my investment company. Jessica and Ryan thought everything was being handled by Ryan's mysterious family trust. I even bought a controlling stake in the resort where they planned to hold the ceremony. It cost me $2 million, money I had saved over decades. But it gave me something more valuable than cash: control. The wedding invitation arrived at my cabin 4 weeks before the ceremony. I opened it with hands that were shaking slightly. Inside was a formal card with elaborate calligraphy. Jessica Vance and Ryan Christopher request the honor of your presence. But there was a note paperclipped to it, handwritten in Jessica's script. Dad, I need to talk to you about the seating arrangements. Can you call me? I called. She answered on the first ring. She sounded nervous. Ryan's family had concerns about the optics, she explained. They were very image conscious. They thought it might be better if I skipped the ceremony itself and just came to a small family dinner the week after. I asked her directly if she wanted me at her wedding. There was a long silence. Then she said Ryan thought it would be for the best. I told her I understood and hung up. That's when I knew what I had to do. 3 weeks before the wedding, I started making arrangements. Not for a gift, not for a reconciliation, for what I called Operation Foundation Check. In construction, before you build anything that lasts, you inspect the foundation. If it's rotten, the whole structure will eventually collapse. Ryan's foundation was made of lies, and I was going to stress test every beam. I contacted my lawyer, Martin Chen, a sharp man in his 50s who had handled my business affairs for 20 years. I explained what I wanted: a legal mechanism that would allow me to pull funding from the wedding if certain conditions were met. Martin drafted what he called a benevolence revocation clause. Essentially, since I was the anonymous benefactor funding the entire event, I retained the right to withdraw support if the recipients engaged in fraud, defamation, or material disrespect to the funding party. Clause 14C was born, but I wasn't going to pull that trigger unless Jessica crossed a line. I still held hope that she would come to her senses, that she would realize what Ryan really was and call off the wedding herself. I watched and waited. 2 weeks before the ceremony, Ryan made his move. Jessica called me, her voice tight and rehearsed. She said she needed to talk about something uncomfortable. Ryan's parents had expressed concern that my presence at the wedding might create awkward conversations with their high society friends. Apparently, when people asked what the bride's father did for a living, it would be difficult to explain that I was a retired construction foreman. I asked Jessica if that's what she thought too. She didn't answer directly. She said she wanted me to be happy, and maybe I would be more comfortable not having to dress up and make small talk with people I didn't know. Maybe I would prefer to celebrate with her privately, somewhere more casual. I told her I would think about it. That night, I sat in my workshop and looked at the photos on the wall. Jessica, at age 7, wearing my hard hat 3 sizes too big. Jessica, at her high school graduation, hugging me so tight I could barely breathe. Jessica, at 21, the day she got her first job, telling me she couldn't have done it without my example. I realized something that made my chest ache. My daughter hadn't become a bad person. She had become a scared person. Ryan had isolated her, convinced her that she needed to be someone different to deserve love. He had taken a strong, capable woman and turned her into someone who was ashamed of where she came from. I decided I wouldn't tell her about the money I had spent. I wouldn't reveal that I had paid for everything. I would let the wedding happen, let her marry this fraud, and then deal with the aftermath. Sometimes people need to touch the fire to understand it burns, but then the invitation arrived. Not the save the date, the actual wedding invitation. I opened it with coffee in my hand. My name wasn't on it. Jessica Vance and Ryan Christopher, along with their families, request the honor of your presence. but in the small print listing the families, only Ryan's fake parents were named. I had been erased from my own daughter's wedding announcement. I called Jessica one more time. I asked her directly why my name wasn't included. She said it was a printing error. She said they had already sent out 200 invitations and it was too expensive to reprint them. She said it didn't matter because everyone knew I was her father. I told her I would be there 6 hours early, ready to walk her down the aisle like we had talked about since she was a little girl. There was a pause. Then she said Ryan's stepfather was going to walk her down the aisle. It would mean a lot to Ryan's family. She hoped I would understand. That's when I knew there was no bottom to this. She would keep sacrificing pieces of me until there was nothing left. I told her I would come to the wedding. I just didn't tell her how. 1 week before the wedding, I drove to Napa Valley alone, not to the resort, to the county records office. I pulled up every document related to the property where Jessica's wedding would be held: permits, zoning variances, ownership history. I wanted to understand the full scope of what I had bought. The resort was beautiful. 70 acres of vineyards and gardens, a main hall that could seat 300, luxury cottages scattered across the hillside. It was the kind of place people saved for years to afford for one night. Jessica's ceremony was scheduled in the Rose Garden at sunset, with a reception in the grand ballroom. I met with the resort manager, a woman named Patricia, who had worked there for 15 years. She didn't know I was the majority shareholder. To her, I was just another investor reviewing the property. I asked her about the event scheduled for the following Saturday. Patricia pulled up the file. She mentioned it was a large wedding, significant revenue for the resort. She also mentioned that the deposit had come through a corporate account, which was unusual but not unheard of for wealthy families who valued privacy. I asked her what would happen if that corporate account withdrew its funding. Patricia looked uncomfortable. She explained that the resort had a strict policy. If final payment wasn't received 48 hours before an event, they had the right to cancel. It had never happened with an event this size, but technically all the vendors would be released from their contracts. The venue would go dark. I thanked her and left. Back at my cabin, I opened my laptop and accessed the security camera system I had quietly installed as part of my ownership rights. I could see every angle of the resort. The Rose Garden where Jessica would say her vows, the ballroom where she would dance, the front gate where guests would arrive. I tested Clause 14C with Martin over the phone. I asked him what would constitute sufficient grounds for activation. He reminded me that fraud, defamation, or material disrespect to the funding party were the triggers. He also reminded me that once activated, the decision was final. There would be no reversal. I asked him if being banned from your own daughter's wedding qualified as material disrespect. Martin was quiet for a moment. Then he said that legally, yes. Morally, he added, that was my call to make. I didn't activate the clause. Not yet. I still wanted to give Jessica one last chance. 2 days before the wedding, I drove back to Napa. I parked outside the resort and waited. Eventually, I saw Jessica and Ryan arrive for what looked like a final walkthrough. I watched them through binoculars from a distance. Jessica looked beautiful but stressed. Ryan looked distracted, constantly on his phone. They spent an hour inside, then came out arguing. I couldn't hear the words, but the body language was clear. Jessica was upset about something. Ryan was dismissive, waving his hand like he was swatting away her concerns. At one point, she grabbed his arm, and he pulled away roughly. That's when I saw something that made my decision for me. Ryan's phone rang. He answered it, walked a few steps away from Jessica, and started talking in a low, urgent voice. I couldn't hear the words, but I saw him gesture toward the resort, then toward Jessica. He laughed, actually laughed. Then he said something into the phone and hung up. When he walked back to Jessica, his face had completely changed. He was smiling, apologetic, attentive. It was like watching someone flip a switch. I realized something in that moment. This wasn't just about a young man who had made bad financial choices. This was about a predator who had chosen my daughter because he thought she came from money. He had researched her, found out about her successful tech career, and assumed there was family wealth to exploit. When he discovered I was just a working-class man, he had convinced Jessica to hide me. I called Martin that night and told him to prepare Clause 14C. I wanted it ready to activate with one phone call. Then I packed my truck and started driving toward Napa Valley. It was time to walk my daughter down the aisle, whether she wanted me there or not. The morning of the wedding, I woke up at 4. I showered, shaved, and put on the only suit I owned. It was 20 years old, bought for my wife's funeral, but it still fit. I looked at myself in the mirror and saw a man who had built half the buildings in Sacramento County, a man who had raised a daughter alone, a man who was about to be treated like trash at his own child's wedding. I loaded my truck and started driving. 6 hours from Sacramento to Napa Valley. 6 hours to think about every moment that had led to this. Every sacrifice I had made, every time I had chosen to work late instead of rest because Jessica needed new shoes or school supplies, every parent-teacher conference where I showed up covered in dust, every birthday cake I had baked myself because I couldn't afford a bakery. I had given my daughter everything I had, and in return, she had given me a red X on a laminated card. I arrived at the resort at 11 in the morning. The ceremony wasn't scheduled until 5, but I wanted to see the setup. I wanted to watch the workers arrange the chairs, hang the lights, prepare the tables. I wanted to see exactly what my money had bought. I parked down the road and walked to the front gate. That's where I met him. The security guard, young guy, maybe 25, wearing a crisp uniform. He had a clipboard and a radio. And he had my photo. He held it up as I approached. He asked me if I was Arthur Vance. I told him I was. He said he had instructions not to let me onto the property. He said it very politely, almost apologetically. He said there had been a family request. I asked him who had made the request. He said he wasn't at liberty to say, but it had come directly from the bride. I stood there for a moment looking past him at the rose garden in the distance. I could see workers setting up the arch where Jessica would exchange vows. I could see the white chairs arranged in perfect rows. I could see the life I had paid for and been excluded from. I thanked the guard and walked back to my truck. I didn't argue. I didn't make a scene. I just pulled out my phone and called Martin. He answered on the first ring. I gave him the code phrase we had agreed on. "The foundation is compromised," I said. Martin asked if I was certain. I told him I was standing outside my daughter's wedding with a photo of my face marked with a red X. I told him that was certain enough. He said he would activate Clause 14C immediately. It would take approximately 5 minutes for the financial systems to process the withdrawal. Once activated, the resort's management would be notified that the funding account had been closed due to breach of contract. All vendor payments would be reversed. The event would be automatically canceled. I asked him if there was any way to reverse the decision once it was made. Martin said no. Once the clause was activated, it was permanent. The money would be returned to my accounts, and the contracts would be voided. I sat in my truck and watched the clock. I thought about calling Jessica. I thought about warning her. I thought about giving her one more chance to fix this. But then I remembered the way she had hesitated when I asked if she wanted me at her wedding. I remembered the way she had erased my name from the invitation. I remembered the way Ryan had laughed on the phone while looking at her. I told Martin to proceed. At exactly 11:17, I opened my iPad and accessed the security cameras. I positioned the truck where I had a clear view of the front gate. And then I watched as the resort manager walked out of the main building with a tablet in her hand, a confused expression on her face. She made a phone call, then another. Then she started walking quickly toward the ballroom. The clock read 11:22 when the lights went out, and that's when the real wedding began. Through the security camera feeds, I watched chaos unfold in real time. The resort manager, Patricia, had gathered the key vendors in the hallway outside the ballroom. Even from the grainy camera footage, I could see her face was pale. She was showing them something on her tablet, and one by one, their expressions changed from confusion to anger. The florist started gathering her arrangements. The caterer made a phone call, then began directing his staff to pack up the prepared food. The band's equipment manager started coiling cables. At 11:45, Jessica and Ryan arrived. They were in one of the cottages getting ready, but someone had called them. I watched them rush into the main building, Jessica still in her preparation robe, Ryan in slacks and an undershirt. Patricia met them in the hallway. I couldn't hear the conversation, but I didn't need to. I saw Jessica's face go from confusion to disbelief to panic. I saw Ryan pull out his phone and start making calls. I saw the moment when Patricia showed them the funding withdrawal notice. Ryan's face turned red. He started gesturing wildly, pointing at Patricia, at the ballroom, at his phone. Jessica stood frozen, one hand over her mouth. Then Ryan tried to run. I watched him bolt toward a side exit. But he only made it to the parking lot before 3 men in suits intercepted him. I recognized them from my investigator's file, debt collectors from Las Vegas. They had been waiting for exactly this moment, when Ryan's house of cards collapsed, and he had nowhere left to hide. The cameras captured Ryan being escorted back inside, the men holding his arms, not roughly, but firmly. They walked him past the hallway where Jessica stood watching. I couldn't see her expression clearly, but I saw her body language. She tried to follow, but Patricia stopped her. They had a brief exchange, and then Jessica broke down completely. By 12:30, guests were starting to arrive. The first few cars pulled up to the gate, elegantly dressed people stepping out into the California sunshine, ready for a wedding. The same security guard who had turned me away now had a different message. The event had been canceled due to unforeseen circumstances. Please return to your hotels and await further information. I watched an elderly couple, probably in their 70s, look at each other in confusion. I watched a group of young people in expensive suits try to argue with the guard. I watched car after car pull up, receive the news, and drive away. At one point, the camera showed 2 people who looked like they were in their 60s, wearing formal attire that seemed just slightly too theatrical. I recognized them from my investigator's photos. Ryan's fake parents, the actors he had hired to play wealthy Connecticut socialites. I watched them approach Patricia and demand to know why they hadn't been paid, not the wedding vendors, them, their acting fee. $200 an hour for the weekend, totaling $4,000. They had been promised cash on the wedding day, and now they wanted it. Patricia looked horrified. She turned to find Jessica, and I watched my daughter's world crumble even further. The cameras captured the moment when she realized Ryan's parents weren't his parents at all. They were performers. Everything was a lie. By 2 in the afternoon, the rose garden stood empty. The white chairs remained in their perfect rows, but there would be no ceremony. The ballroom was dark. The champagne towers were being disassembled. The wedding cake, 5 tiers of custom design, sat abandoned on a prep table. Through all of this, I sat in my truck and felt nothing. No satisfaction, no guilt, just a hollow sense of necessity. This was what had to happen. Jessica needed to see Ryan for what he really was. She needed to understand that appearances meant nothing, that respectability couldn't be bought, that the man who had convinced her to ban her own father from her wedding was the same man who had built his entire life on fraud. At 3:15, I watched Jessica emerge from the cottage wearing jeans and a t-shirt, the wedding dress left behind. She got into her car alone and drove away. I gave her a 15-minute head start. Then I started my truck and followed. Jessica didn't drive back to San Francisco. She drove east, toward Sacramento, toward home. I followed at a distance, my old F-150 staying several cars back on Highway 80. I knew where she was going before she did. The sun was setting when she pulled into my driveway. I had taken a different route and arrived 5 minutes before her. I parked my truck in the workshop and watched from inside as she sat in her car, not moving, just sitting there with her hands on the steering wheel, staring at my cabin. After 20 minutes, she finally got out. Her face was streaked with dried tears. Her hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail. She looked nothing like the polished, sophisticated woman who had been too embarrassed to have me at her wedding. She looked like the daughter I remembered, tired, lost, real. She walked up to the porch and knocked. I watched her through the window and didn't move. She knocked again, harder. Then she called out. She said she knew I was home because my truck was there. She said she needed to talk to me. She said she was sorry. I stayed silent. She started crying again. She said Ryan was gone. The debt collectors had taken him somewhere. His phone was disconnected. The fake parents had threatened to sue her. The resort was demanding she cover the vendor cancellation fees. Her credit cards were maxed out from deposits she had put down. She had nowhere to go. I wanted to open that door. Every instinct I had as a father wanted to let her in, make her coffee, tell her everything would be okay. But I knew if I did that, nothing would change. She would fall back into old patterns. She would let me fix everything, and she would never understand what she had done. I walked to the door but didn't open it. I spoke through the wood. I told her she had made a choice. She had chosen a man who saw her as a transaction over a father who had spent 50 years working with his hands to give her a life. She had chosen appearances over substance. She had banned me from the most important day of her life because I didn't fit the image she wanted to project. She begged me to open the door. She said Ryan had manipulated her, that she hadn't known the truth, that she had been stupid and blind. I told her she was right about one thing. She had been blind. But not just to Ryan. She had been blind to what really mattered. She had been blind to the difference between a man who builds things and a man who fakes them. I told her I loved her. I always would. But love didn't mean enabling. It didn't mean rescuing her from consequences she needed to face. Then I did something that hurt me more than it hurt her. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a key. I slid it under the door. I told her it was to a studio apartment in Oakland near the waterfront. The rent was paid for 1 month. There was a job waiting for her at a diner 2 blocks away. The owner was expecting her at 6 in the morning. I told her if she could survive 1 year without asking me for money, we would talk. Not before. She needed to understand what work meant, what dignity meant, what it felt like to earn something rather than have it handed to you or faked. She picked up the key. She stopped crying. For a moment, there was just silence. Then she said something that told me she understood. She said, "Thank you." She walked back to her car. She sat there for another 10 minutes, holding that key, looking at my cabin. Then she started the engine and drove away. I watched her taillights disappear down the road. I poured myself a glass of whiskey and sat on my porch in the dark. I had just destroyed my daughter's wedding, exposed her fiancé as a fraud, and refused to let her into my home. But I had also just given her the greatest gift I could, a chance to discover who she really was, without anyone else defining it for her. Now, all I could do was wait and see if she would take it. I didn't hear from Jessica for 3 months. Not a call, not a text, not a single word. I had to stop myself from driving to Oakland, from checking on her. This had to be her journey, not mine. But that didn't mean I wasn't watching. I had a friend who lived near the diner. I asked him to stop by occasionally, order coffee, see if a young woman named Jessica was working there. He reported back every few weeks. She was there. She looked tired, but she was showing up. 4 months in, my friend told me Jessica had picked up a second job washing dishes at a restaurant downtown. She was working 14-hour days. 5 months in, he said she had moved to a cheaper apartment to save money. 7 months in, he mentioned she had started taking night classes in project management at a community college. I wanted to call her so badly, it physically hurt. But I kept my word. 1 year. That was the deal. I filled my days with work. At 75, I didn't need to work anymore, but I took consulting jobs anyway, small projects, a church renovation, a community center addition, things that kept my hands busy and my mind occupied. I also kept tabs on Ryan. My investigator informed me that he had declared bankruptcy. The gambling debts had been restructured through a legal settlement that left him working 2 jobs to pay them off over the next 10 years. His social media accounts, once full of luxury lifestyle photos, had gone silent. He had moved back to Arizona to live with his real parents, middle-class people, who ran a small hardware store. At the 8-month mark, something unexpected happened. I received a letter, not from Jessica, from the diner owner in Oakland. She said Jessica had asked her to pass along a message. The message was simple. I understand now. I kept that letter in my shirt pocket and read it every morning. At 10 months, my friend reported that Jessica had been promoted to shift supervisor at the diner. She was training new employees. He said she looked different, stronger. She had cut her hair short, wore practical clothes, and moved with a confidence he hadn't seen before. At 11 months, I broke my own rule. I drove to Oakland and parked across the street from the diner. I sat there for an hour, watching her work through the window. She was taking orders, refilling coffee, clearing tables. She was doing the same kind of work millions of people do every day to survive. And she was doing it well. She looked up at one point, and our eyes met through the glass. I froze. I thought she might come outside, might break the 1-year agreement early. But she just gave me a small nod and went back to work. I drove home, crying. Not sad tears, proud tears. My daughter had been broken down to nothing and had built herself back up. She had learned what I had been trying to teach her since she was a child. That value doesn't come from what you have. It comes from what you do. On the morning of the 365th day, I woke up at 4:30. I showered, dressed in my work clothes, and drove to Oakland. I walked into that diner at exactly 6 in the morning. Jessica was wiping down a table. She looked up when the bell chimed. We locked eyes for a long moment. Neither of us smiled. We didn't need to. The pride on her face said everything. She grabbed a coffee pot and walked over. She asked me if I wanted the usual. I told her I did. She poured the coffee, and it was the best cup I had ever tasted in my life. Not because of the coffee itself, but because of who was pouring it. We sat in a booth near the back. She slid a folder across the table. Inside were receipts, 12 months of rent payments, pay stubs from both jobs, college enrollment papers, a handwritten budget showing every dollar she had earned and spent. She told me she wanted me to see proof that she had done this herself. I pushed the folder back and told her I never doubted she could. I told her I was sorry for what I had to do, but I wasn't sorry for the result. She said she understood why I did it. She said Ryan had shown her a life that looked perfect on the surface, and she had been so desperate to believe in it that she had forgotten where she came from. She had forgotten that her father, the man with the calloused hands and the old truck, had more integrity in his little finger than Ryan had in his entire body. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out an envelope. Inside was a contract. A job offer from my construction company, not a handout, a real position. Junior project coordinator. Starting salary was modest but fair. She would work her way up like everyone else. She read it carefully. Then she looked at me and asked if I was sure. She said she hadn't earned it yet. I told her she had earned more than she knew. Jessica started working for my company 3 weeks later. I made sure she reported to someone other than me. She needed to prove herself without anyone thinking she had special treatment. For the first 6 months, she worked as an assistant project coordinator on a senior housing development in Sacramento. Her supervisor, a tough woman named Maria, who had been in construction for 30 years, told me Jessica was one of the hardest workers she had ever seen. She showed up early, stayed late, and never complained. She asked questions, took notes, and treated every person on the job site with respect, from the architects to the laborers. What happened to Ryan became clear about a year after the wedding collapse. My investigator informed me that after declaring bankruptcy and moving back to Arizona, he had actually started turning his life around. He worked at his parents' hardware store during the day and took accounting courses at night. He posted a public apology online, not to Jessica specifically, but a general acknowledgement that he had lived dishonestly and hurt people. It wasn't enough to erase what he had done, but it was something. I stopped tracking him after that. He had his own foundation to rebuild. The fake parents who had been hired to play wealthy socialites, they sued Ryan for unpaid acting fees and won a small judgment that he was paying off in monthly installments. I heard through legal channels that they had been uncomfortable with the deception from the beginning, but needed the money. They retired from acting entirely after the incident. The resort in Napa Valley continued to operate successfully under my ownership. I kept Patricia as manager and gave her a raise. She never knew I was the one who had pulled the funding that day. I made sure all legitimate vendor claims were settled fairly, not from the canceled event, but from my personal accounts. The florist, the caterer, the musicians, none of them deserved to suffer for Ryan's fraud. They all received full payment plus a bonus for their trouble. As for Jessica and me, we rebuilt slowly. It wasn't dramatic. There was no single moment of reconciliation. It was coffee on Saturday mornings. It was phone calls about project details that turned into conversations about life. It was the day she asked me to teach her how to use a table saw, and I spent 3 hours in my workshop showing her the same techniques my father had taught me. 18 months after she started working for the company, Jessica was promoted to full project coordinator. She led the renovation of an elementary school, bringing the project in under budget and ahead of schedule. When the school had its reopening ceremony, I watched her stand in front of parents and administrators and explain the work that had been done. She wore work boots and a company jacket. Her hands had small scars from learning to use tools. She looked nothing like the woman who had been embarrassed by my calloused hands. 2 years after the canceled wedding, Jessica invited me to dinner at her apartment. She had moved from Oakland to a small house in Sacramento, close enough that we could see each other regularly. When I arrived, she had cooked dinner herself, nothing fancy, just spaghetti and salad, and we ate at her kitchen table. After dinner, she asked me if I regretted what I had done. If I regretted destroying her wedding, refusing to let her in that night, making her work for a year before talking to her. I told her I regretted that it had to happen, but I didn't regret doing it. Sometimes love means letting people fall so they can learn to stand on their own. She told me she had spent a long time being angry at me, but somewhere around month 7, while scrubbing dishes in a restaurant basement, she had realized something. I hadn't destroyed her wedding. Ryan had, and I hadn't abandoned her. I had given her the chance to save herself. That's when she showed me what she had been working on: architectural drawings, plans for a small community housing project for elderly people on fixed incomes. She wanted to build something that mattered, something that helped people like me who had worked hard their whole lives, but might not have families to care for them. She asked if I would partner with her on it, not as her father, as a business partner, equal footing. I looked at those drawings and saw my daughter's future, not the fake future Ryan had tried to sell her, her real future, built on skill, integrity, and purpose. I told her yes. We started construction 6 months later. The project took 2 years to complete, but when it opened, it housed 32 senior citizens who otherwise wouldn't have had safe, affordable places to live. At the dedication ceremony, Jessica gave a speech. She talked about learning the difference between what looks impressive and what actually matters. She talked about the value of hard work and the importance of dignity at every stage of life. She didn't mention the canceled wedding. She didn't mention Ryan, but at the end of her speech she thanked one person by name. Her father, she said, who taught her that the strongest foundations are built slowly, with care, and with honest work. I sat in the front row with my calloused hands folded in my lap, wearing the same kind of work clothes I had worn my entire life. And I realized something I hadn't fully understood before. I didn't lose my daughter the day her wedding was canceled. I got her back. Last month, Jessica told me she had been contacted by someone from her past, a man who wanted to apologize in person. Ryan had reached out through mutual acquaintances, saying he was 4 years sober from gambling, working steadily, and wanted to make amends as part of his recovery process. Jessica asked my opinion. I told her the choice was hers, but that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It means choosing not to let the past poison the future. She met with him once in a public coffee shop and told me later that he had seemed genuinely different, humbled. He didn't ask for anything. He just apologized and wished her well. She told him she hoped he continued building a better life. Then she came to my workshop, and we spent the afternoon working on a set of custom cabinets for one of the housing units. We didn't talk about Ryan. We just worked side by side, the way a father and daughter should. These days, Jessica runs 3 projects simultaneously. She's earned her contractor's license and built a reputation for quality work and fair dealing. Young people in the industry ask her for mentorship. Families trust her with their homes. She built something real. As for me, I'm 77 now. I still work a few hours most days, mostly consulting and teaching young contractors the old skills. My hands are more gnarled than ever, but they still work. And every Saturday morning, my daughter comes by for coffee. We sit on my porch, watch the sunrise, and talk about whatever needs talking about. She asked me recently if I ever think about that day. The security guard with my photo, the red X through my face. I told her I do, but not with anger, with gratitude. Because that was the day I stopped being a wallet and became a father again. That was the day she stopped chasing a fake dream and started building a real life. She said it was the worst day of her life that became the first day of her real life. Last week, Jessica called me with news. She's been seeing someone, a civil engineer she met on a project. She said he's kind, steady, and genuinely admires her work. She said he asked her about family, and she told him all about me, the construction, the workshop, the hard lessons. She said he wants to meet me, not to impress me, just to meet the man who taught her what integrity looks like. I told her to bring him by on Saturday. We'll have coffee and maybe I'll show him the table saw. She laughed and said he'd like that. Then she said something that made my whole life feel worthwhile. She said, "I'm proud to be your daughter, Dad." That's all a father really needs to hear, that the work mattered, that the sacrifices counted, that the lessons took root. I built houses for 47 years. But the most important thing I ever built was the foundation that let my daughter rebuild herself. And that foundation is still standing. So that's my story. From a security gate rejection to building a life worth living. If you made it this far, I'd like to know, where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. And if this story meant something to you, hit that subscribe button. Sometimes the hardest lessons build the strongest people. Thanks for listening.